In the small town of Selma, Alabama, early 1965 brought a sense of restlessness that hung in the air like thick summer heat. The once quiet streets were now filled with determination and hope as civil rights activists worked tirelessly to help black residents register to vote. You could feel the energy building. Something big was about to happen. Local resident James Wilson often sat on his front porch watching the growing crowds gather at Brown Chapel AME Church. He'd seen how the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, and Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, volunteers would walk with elderly black citizens to the courthouse only to be turned away time and time again. The sight made his heart heavy, but the spirit of the people remained unbroken. The courthouse steps had become a daily battleground of sorts. Sheriff Jim Clark, known for his fierce opposition to civil rights, had made it his personal mission to intimidate anyone who dared to stand in line to register. He'd wear his military-style uniform, a pistol on his hip, and that infamous button that read, "Never," pinned to his chest, a clear message against integration. One cold February morning, Wilson watched as an elderly woman, probably in her 70s, slowly made her way up those courthouse steps. She had been trying to register for 3 weeks straight. Each time, she was sent home with a new excuse. The forms weren't right, the registrar was busy, or some other made-up reason. But she kept coming back, her dignity intact, her head held high. The movement was growing stronger by the day. Young people from local high schools would skip classes to join the lines, knowing they might face arrest. Church basements became organizing centers where people would practice what to do if they were attacked, how to protect their heads, how to fall safely, how to remain peaceful even in the face of violence. The tension in Selma was like a pot about to boil over. At night, local families would host out-of-town activists, sharing meals and stories around kitchen tables. They'd talk about their hopes for their children's future, about being able to eat at any restaurant they chose, or simply being able to vote without fear. These kitchen table conversations were where the real movement lived, in the hearts and homes of ordinary people dreaming of extraordinary change. Wilson noticed how the local phone lines would buzz with activity as organizers coordinated their efforts. They'd pass messages from house to house, church to church, planning their next moves like a carefully choreographed dance. The young activists would practice their songs, "Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around," and "We Shall Overcome," their voices carrying hope through the evening air. But it wasn't just about the big moments or the planned protests. It was about the small acts of courage too. Like the local shop owner who would secretly provide supplies to the movement, knowing he might lose business from white customers if they found out. Or the school teacher who would hold late-night literacy classes, helping people prepare for the unfair voter registration tests. The air grew thicker with anticipation as February turned to March. Everyone could sense that something momentous was approaching. In the barbershops and beauty parlors, at church socials and street corners, people whispered about plans for a march, not just any march, but one that would take them all the way to Montgomery, right to the steps of the state capitol. Wilson would later remember these days as the calm before the storm. He saw how people began storing extra food and medical supplies, how they'd exchanged phone numbers and made plans for who would take care of whose children if things went wrong. The community was preparing itself, drawing strength from unity and shared purpose. As the sun set each evening, casting long shadows across Selma's streets, meetings would continue in churches and homes. People would pray together, sing together, and remind each other why they were fighting. They weren't just fighting for the right to vote. They were fighting for their humanity, their dignity, and their children's future. The story of these early days in 1965 Selma wasn't just about the big names that would later fill history books. It was about the countless unnamed heroes, the mothers who packed sandwiches for protesters, the teenagers who faced down police dogs, the elderly who shared stories of past struggles to inspire the young. These were the people who made the movement real, who gave it its heart and soul. In those final days, before what would become known as Bloody Sunday, there was a mix of fear and determination in the air. People knew the risks they were taking, but they also knew they couldn't turn back. The time for change had come, and Selma was ready to play its part in history. This was more than just a moment in time. It was the beginning of a story that would change America forever. And as James Wilson sat on his porch, watching history unfold before his eyes, He knew he was witnessing something that future generations would need to remember and understand. The tension in Selma reached its breaking point after a peaceful protest in nearby Marion, Alabama ended in tragedy. On a cold February night, state troopers confronted protesters outside a cafe. In the chaos that followed, a young man named Jimmy Lee Jackson was shot while trying to protect his mother and grandfather. He died 8 days later in the hospital. The news of Jackson's death spread through the community like wildfire. In living rooms and church basements across Selma, people gathered to mourn and to plan. They knew they couldn't let this death be in vain. Something had to change, and it had to change now. James Wilson remembered sitting in on one of these meetings at Brown Chapel. The room was packed with people, their faces lit by determination despite their grief. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood before them, his voice steady and clear as he proposed something that seemed both impossible and absolutely necessary. A march from Selma to Montgomery, right to Governor Wallace's doorstep. The idea caught fire in people's imaginations. 54 miles might as well have been 500, given the dangers they would face, but nobody seemed deterred. Local residents started preparing for the journey, gathering supplies and making plans. Some folks offered their homes as safe houses along the route, while others organized food and water stations. The preparations weren't just physical, they were spiritual too. In the days leading up to the march, churches held special services where people prayed for strength and courage. They knew they were about to face something bigger than themselves. Young people practiced non-violent resistance techniques, learning how to protect themselves without fighting back. Word of the planned march spread beyond Selma's borders. Civil rights workers from other states began arriving, bringing with them fresh energy and determination. Local families opened their homes to these visitors, sharing whatever they had. Over simple meals of cornbread and beans, they talked about their hopes for what this march might achieve. The atmosphere in town was electric. People who had never been politically active before found themselves drawn into the movement. A local shopkeeper, who had always tried to stay neutral, began secretly storing medical supplies in his back room. A retired nurse organized first aid training sessions, teaching people how to treat tear gas exposure and other injuries they might face. But there was fear too, running like an undercurrent beneath the excitement. Parents hugged their children a little tighter at night. Folks made sure to travel in groups, watching out for each other. They'd seen too much violence not to be cautious. Yet somehow, the fear only seemed to strengthen their resolve. In the Black community, people started sharing their stories more openly, stories of being turned away from voting booths, of failing impossible literacy tests, of facing intimidation when they tried to register. Each story added fuel to the fire of determination. This march wasn't just about one tragic death anymore, it was about decades of injustice finally being challenged. The planning meetings grew larger and more frequent. Maps were studied, routes were debated, and contingency plans were made. They knew the authorities would try to stop them, but they were prepared to face whatever came. The question wasn't if they would march, but how many would join them. Dr. King and other leaders worked to ensure everything was organized properly. They emphasized the importance of remaining peaceful, no matter what happened. "We're marching for our rights," they would say, "but we're also marching for our dignity." These words resonated deeply with everyone involved. As the day of the march approached, there was a sense that they were standing on the edge of history. People began writing letters to their loved ones, just in case. They packed their Sunday best clothes. They wanted to look dignified when they marched. Some even practiced walking long distances, preparing their bodies for the journey ahead. The night before the planned march, few people in Selma slept well. In homes across the city, folks stayed up late, talking in hushed voices about what might happen the next day. They could feel the weight of what they were about to do, but they also felt the rightness of it. James Wilson later recalled how the air felt different that morning, like the whole world was holding its breath. People gathered in small groups, checking on each other, sharing words of encouragement. They knew that by sunset, everything might be different, for better or worse. This wasn't just about planning a march anymore. It was about standing up and saying enough is enough. It was about ordinary people doing extraordinary things because they had to, because the time had come. The catalyst of Jackson's death had lit a fire that couldn't be extinguished, and Selma was about to show the world what courage looked like. The morning of March 7, 1965, dawned cold and clear in Selma. People began gathering at Brown Chapel early, their breath visible in the crisp morning air. Some carried small backpacks with water and a sandwich. Others held nothing but their hopes and prayers. Nearly 600 people stood ready to march, each one knowing they might not return home that night. James Wilson watched from his porch as the crowd grew. He noticed how folks helped each other pin on their Sunday best clothes, straightening collars and adjusting hats. They wanted to look dignified for what was coming. The atmosphere was a strange mix of church service and military preparation, hymns being sung while veterans of previous protests gave last-minute advice to newcomers. The march leaders stood on the church steps giving final instructions. Their voices carried across the crowd. "Remember, no matter what happens, we remain peaceful. We're marching for our rights, and we'll do it with dignity." People nodded, their faces set with determination. Some older folks had tears in their eyes, remembering all the years that had led to this moment. As they began moving toward the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the marchers fell into an orderly line, 2 by 2. They walked with their heads held high, some singing softly, others in prayerful silence. The bridge loomed ahead of them, its steel arc rising against the sky like a challenge. At the foot of the bridge, everyone could see what waited on the other side. State troopers stood in a solid line, their uniforms dark against the pavement. Behind them were mounted officers on horseback. The sight made some marchers pause, but only for a moment. They'd come too far to turn back now. The first steps onto the bridge felt like stepping into history. The sound of hundreds of feet on the steel bridge created a rhythm, like a heartbeat. As they reached the highest point of the bridge, the whole world seemed to pause. Below them, the muddy waters of the Alabama River flowed on, unaware of what was about to happen. That's when everything changed. The troopers began advancing. Through bullhorns, they ordered the marchers to turn back. When no one moved, tear gas canisters exploded among the crowd. The peaceful scene erupted into chaos. The air filled with screams and the sound of clubs hitting flesh. Wilson, who had followed the crowd to the bridge, would never forget what he saw next. Mounted officers charged into the crowd, their clubs swinging. People tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The tear gas burned their eyes and throats. Those at the front of the march took the worst of it, falling under the troopers' attacks. Some tried to help the fallen, only to be beaten themselves. Others stumbled back towards Selma, gasping for air through the tear gas. The sight of peaceful people being attacked so brutally shocked everyone who witnessed it. Local photographers and news cameras captured it all, even as they too became targets. In the chaos, acts of incredible bravery emerged. People who had been knocked down got back up, helping others to safety. Some formed human chains to protect the most vulnerable. Through it all, not a single marcher fought back. Their commitment to non-violence held, even in the face of such brutality. The retreat back to Brown Chapel was a painful journey. People helped carry the injured, using their clothes as makeshift stretchers. The church became a makeshift hospital. Doctors and nurses who had prepared for violence worked tirelessly to treat the wounded. The air was thick with the smell of tear gas that still clung to people's clothes. That evening, as news of what had happened spread, phones began ringing across Selma. People called their families, their friends, anyone who would listen. They needed the world to know what had happened on that bridge. The images of peaceful marchers being attacked would soon be broadcast across the nation, shocking millions of Americans who had never witnessed such violence. In the days that followed, people would refer to that Sunday as Bloody Sunday. The name stuck, becoming a powerful symbol of both the brutality faced by civil rights marchers and their unwavering courage in the face of violence. The events of that day would change the course of the civil rights movement and American history. As night fell over Selma, the injured were still being treated, and plans were already being made for what would come next. Because despite the violence, despite the fear and pain, one thing was clear: they would march again. The bridge had become more than just a structure of steel and concrete. It had become a symbol of the struggle for justice, and they would cross it, no matter what it took. James Wilson, like many others who witnessed that day, would carry the memories forever. But what stayed with him most wasn't the violence. It was the courage of ordinary people who faced down brutality with dignity, who refused to let fear turn them around. They had shown the world what true bravery looked like, and their story would inspire generations to come. The images of Bloody Sunday spread across America like wildfire. That evening, television stations interrupted their regular programs to show footage of peaceful marchers being beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. In living rooms across the country, people watched in horror as the scenes of violence unfolded before their eyes. James Wilson remembered sitting in his cousin's house, watching the news coverage. The black and white television footage couldn't fully capture the brutality he'd witnessed, but it was enough to shake the nation's conscience. People who had never given much thought to civil rights suddenly couldn't look away. The phones in Selma started ringing nonstop. Reporters from major newspapers and television networks poured into the small town. They wanted to interview everyone: the injured marchers, the witnesses, the doctors who treated the wounded. The quiet streets of Selma had become the center of national attention. In churches and community centers across America, people gathered to pray and plan. Religious leaders of all faiths spoke out against the violence. College students began organizing trips to Selma. Labor unions pledged their support. It seemed like the whole country was waking up to what had been happening in the South all along. Dr. King and other civil rights leaders seized this moment of national outrage. They sent out urgent calls for supporters to come to Selma. "We need your bodies and your voices," they said. "We need you to stand with us." The response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life began making their way to Alabama. The injured from Bloody Sunday became powerful symbols of the movement. Despite their bandages and bruises, they spoke to reporters about why they had marched and why they would march again. Their dignity in the face of violence moved many Americans who had previously been silent on civil rights issues. In Washington, D.C., politicians couldn't ignore what had happened. President Johnson faced mounting pressure to act. Civil rights leaders met with government officials, pushing for federal protection for the marchers and for stronger voting rights legislation. The violence on the bridge had made it impossible for the nation's leaders to look the other way. Back in Selma, the community pulled together to prepare for what would come next. People opened their homes to the arriving supporters. Local restaurants cooked extra food. Churches set up cots in their basements. The town that had been so divided now saw an outpouring of unity and support from unexpected places. Even some white residents of Selma, who had previously stayed silent, began to speak out. They couldn't reconcile the violence they'd witnessed with their Christian values. A few local business owners publicly supported the marchers despite threats of boycotts. Small cracks were appearing in the wall of segregation. The national media attention brought both hope and tension to Selma. Reporters roamed the streets looking for stories. Some locals worried about how their town would be remembered in history. Others felt relief that the world was finally seeing what they'd been living with for so long. Support came in many forms. Money and supplies poured in from across the country. Doctors and nurses volunteered their services. Civil rights organizations set up communication networks to coordinate the growing movement. Every day brought new allies to the cause. The impact reached beyond American shores. International newspapers carried the story of Bloody Sunday. Civil rights leaders received messages of support from around the world. What had happened on that bridge in Selma had become a global symbol of the struggle for human rights. In the days following Bloody Sunday, something shifted in the American consciousness. People who had never taken a stand on civil rights found themselves unable to remain neutral. The images of peaceful marchers being attacked forced many to confront the reality of racism in America. James Wilson noticed how differently people carried themselves now. There was a new determination in their eyes. The violence hadn't broken their spirit, it had strengthened it. They walked with their heads held higher, their voices stronger. They knew the whole world was watching now. As plans began forming for another march, the mood in Selma was different. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by a sense of purpose. They had shown America what they were facing, and America had responded. Now they would show the world what courage and determination looked like. The response to Bloody Sunday proved that sometimes it takes a moment of darkness to bring light to a situation. The violence on the Edmund Pettus Bridge had awakened the nation's conscience, and nothing would ever be the same. The next march would be different, because now they wouldn't be marching alone. Just 2 days after Bloody Sunday, the streets of Selma filled again with determined faces. This time, the crowd looked different. Alongside local residents stood hundreds of clergy members from across the country, priests in their collars, rabbis wearing yarmulkes, and ministers in their robes. They had answered Dr. King's call to come and stand with the people of Selma. James Wilson watched as the new arrivals gathered at Brown Chapel. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful. Many of these people had never joined a civil rights march before, but the images of Bloody Sunday had moved them to action. They came knowing they might face the same violence, yet they came anyway. The morning air buzzed with activity. People hugged old friends and made new ones. A group of nuns helped bandage the feet of marchers still injured from Sunday. Local families shared their breakfast with visitors. Despite the serious purpose, there was a sense of community building with every passing moment. This march felt different from the start. Dr. King led the way, surrounded by religious leaders from every faith. Behind them walked the people who had been beaten on Bloody Sunday, their wounds still visible but their spirits unbroken. The line of marchers stretched back for blocks. As they approached the Edmund Pettus Bridge, everyone grew quiet. The memory of what had happened there just 2 days before was still fresh. State troopers again lined the other side of the bridge, their presence a clear threat. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The marchers reached the top of the bridge, the same spot where the violence had erupted on Sunday. Everyone held their breath. Dr. King paused, kneeling down to pray. One by one, the marchers behind him did the same. The sight of hundreds of people kneeling in prayer on that bridge became another powerful image of the movement. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of continuing forward, Dr. King stood up and turned around. He led the marchers back to Brown Chapel. Some were confused, others disappointed. But King explained that he was waiting for federal court protection before risking more lives. This became known as Turnaround Tuesday. The decision to turn back wasn't an easy one. Some younger activists felt it was a mistake. But older members of the community understood the strategy. They knew that sometimes taking a step back could lead to bigger steps forward. The nation was watching now. They had to be smart about their next moves. Back at Brown Chapel, people gathered to discuss what would happen next. The out-of-town supporters shared stories of what had brought them to Selma. A rabbi from New York spoke about seeing the Bloody Sunday footage and knowing he had to come. A priest from Chicago talked about his congregation raising money to send him. The conversation wasn't just about the march anymore. People shared their experiences of discrimination, their hopes for their children's future, their dreams of what America could become. The religious leaders listened and learned, many of them hearing these stories for the first time. Throughout the day, more supporters arrived. Cars and buses pulled into Selma carrying people from all over the country. Each new arrival brought fresh energy and determination to the movement. The setback at the bridge hadn't discouraged them. If anything, it had strengthened their resolve. Local families continued opening their homes to the visitors. Over shared meals, they built connections that would last long after the marches ended. White clergy members who had never spent time in black homes found their prejudices melting away as they experienced Southern hospitality firsthand. The media coverage of Turnaround Tuesday was different from Bloody Sunday. The images of religious leaders kneeling in prayer on the bridge showed another side of the movement. It demonstrated both its spiritual power and its strategic wisdom. The nation saw that these weren't just protesters, they were people of faith standing up for what was right. As night fell, planning meetings continued. Everyone knew this was just one step in a longer journey. They would march again, but this time with federal protection. The crowds would be bigger, the message stronger. Turnaround Tuesday wasn't a retreat, it was a pause before a bigger push forward. James Wilson, like many others, went to bed that night feeling both tired and hopeful. The day hadn't gone as planned, but something important had happened on that bridge. They had shown that courage sometimes means knowing when to step back, and that wisdom can be as powerful as determination. The story of Turnaround Tuesday became another chapter in Selma's history. It showed that the movement could be both passionate and strategic, both determined and wise. The next march would come soon enough, and when it did, they would be ready. For now, they had shown the world another kind of strength, the strength to wait for the right moment. The days following Turnaround Tuesday brought dramatic changes to Selma and the nation. In Washington, D.C., President Johnson found himself at the center of a political storm. The images from Bloody Sunday had shocked his conscience, and pressure was mounting from all sides for federal action. James Wilson, like many others in Selma, stayed glued to his radio for news updates. The president had summoned Alabama Governor George Wallace to the White House for an urgent meeting. Everyone knew Wallace as a fierce defender of segregation, but now he faced pressure he couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, in the federal courthouse, something remarkable was happening. Judge Frank M. Johnson, Jr. was hearing testimony about the right to march. The courtroom was packed as marchers shared their stories. One elderly woman described being turned away from registering to vote 15 times. A young man showed the scars from Bloody Sunday. Their testimonies painted a powerful picture of life under segregation. Back in Selma's streets, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. More supporters kept arriving every day. Local families were still hosting visitors in their homes, sharing whatever they had. The conversations around dinner tables went late into the night as people discussed what might happen next. President Johnson's response came in two parts. First, he went before Congress to introduce the Voting Rights Act. His speech was broadcast nationwide. In living rooms across Selma, people gathered around televisions and radios to listen. When Johnson said, "We shall overcome," using the words of their own freedom songs, many couldn't hold back their tears. The second response came through Judge Johnson's court. After hearing days of testimony, he ruled in favor of the marchers. His decision was clear and powerful. The right to march for voting rights was protected by the Constitution. The state of Alabama could not stop them. But Judge Johnson went further. He ordered federal protection for the marchers. This meant U.S. Marshals, FBI agents, and federal troops would guard them on their journey to Montgomery. It was an unprecedented level of federal support for a civil rights protest. The news spread through Selma like electricity. People ran from house to house sharing the news. In church basements and community centers, planning meetings took on new energy. Now they could march not just with moral authority, but with the full protection of federal law. The logistics of organizing such a massive march were daunting. How would they feed thousands of people on the road? Where would they sleep? What about bathroom facilities? Local organizers worked around the clock to solve these practical problems. They mapped out rest stops, arranged for water stations, and coordinated with supporters along the route. Federal officials began arriving in Selma to plan security. They met with march leaders to work out the details. The sight of federal agents working with civil rights activists instead of against them was something new. It gave people hope that real change was possible. Governor Wallace wasn't happy about the federal intervention, but he had no choice. The president had made it clear, either Alabama would protect the marchers or federal troops would. Wallace's power to stop the movement was slipping away. James Wilson noticed how the mood in town had shifted. People walked taller, spoke more confidently. The federal protection meant they could focus on the march itself instead of worrying about violence. Plans that had seemed impossible just weeks ago were now becoming reality. Local businesses that had once stayed neutral began offering support. A grocery store donated food for the marchers. A pharmacy stocked up on first aid supplies. Even some white residents who had opposed the movement started to reconsider their positions. The national media returned to Selma, but this time to cover a different story. Instead of violence and confrontation, they would document a historic victory for civil rights. Reporters interviewed local residents about what the federal protection meant to them. Many spoke about feeling, for the first time, that their government was on their side. As final preparations were made, there was a sense that everything was changing. The old order of segregation and intimidation was crumbling. The federal government had finally taken a clear stand for civil rights. The march to Montgomery would be more than just a protest. It would be a triumph of justice over injustice. James Wilson would later say that these days felt like watching history turn a corner. The same bridge that had been the scene of brutal violence would soon see thousands march across it safely, protected by federal law. It was proof that change was possible, that persistence and courage could overcome even the strongest resistance. On March 21, 1965, Selma woke up to a morning unlike any other. The streets were filled before dawn as thousands gathered for the historic march to Montgomery. The air buzzed with excitement and determination. This time, they would make it all the way. James Wilson stood among the crowd, amazed at the transformation. National Guard troops lined the route, but this time they were there to protect, not prevent. FBI agents coordinated with march leaders. Military helicopters circled overhead, watching for any threats to the marchers' safety. The crowd was unlike anything Selma had ever seen. People of all races, religions, and backgrounds stood together. Famous civil rights leaders walked alongside local residents who had been fighting this battle for years. Young and old, rich and poor. The march had brought them all together. As they crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, many people wept. This bridge, where blood had been spilled just 2 weeks before, now became a symbol of triumph. The marchers sang freedom songs as they walked, their voices carrying across the Alabama countryside. The journey wasn't easy. They walked up to 12 miles each day under the hot Alabama sun. But supporters had organized everything perfectly. At rest stops, local families provided food and water. Doctors checked on the elderly and those still nursing injuries from Bloody Sunday. In the evenings, they camped in fields offered by sympathetic farmers. The nights were filled with music and storytelling. People shared their experiences of the movement, their hopes for the future. Young activists learned from older civil rights workers who had been fighting for change for decades. These evening gatherings became as important as the marching itself. Along the highway, people came out to watch. Some offered water or encouragement. Others stood in silent witness. The sight of thousands marching peacefully under federal protection was something many never thought they'd see. Each step forward felt like a step toward a different America. The marchers grew in number as they approached Montgomery. What had started as several thousand became tens of thousands. People arrived from across the country to join the final leg of the journey. The highway became a river of humanity, flowing toward justice. On the 5th day, they reached Montgomery. The crowd had swelled to 25,000 people. As they approached the state capitol, the sight was breathtaking. The same building that had once stood as a symbol of segregation now faced a sea of faces demanding change. At the Capitol steps, the marchers gathered for a final rally. Speakers talked about what this moment meant, not just for Alabama, but for the whole nation. They spoke about the people who had died for this cause, about the sacrifices made, about the work still to come. The impact of the march was immediate and lasting. Within months, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The barriers that had kept black citizens from voting began to fall. Registration numbers rose across the South as people finally gained the right that had been denied for so long. But the march's impact went beyond voting rights. It showed what peaceful protest could achieve. It demonstrated that federal power could be used to protect civil rights. Most importantly, it proved that ordinary people standing together could change the course of history. James Wilson, like many others who participated, would tell this story to his children and grandchildren. He would describe how it felt to be part of something so much bigger than himself. How the fear and pain of Bloody Sunday had been transformed into triumph just 2 weeks later. The march from Selma to Montgomery became more than just a historical event. It became a symbol of hope. It showed that no matter how long the road or how difficult the journey, justice was possible. The courage of those marchers inspired generations of activists who would follow. 54 miles became more than just a distance. It became a measure of how far a movement could go, how much change was possible. The highway they walked became a path that others would follow in their own struggles for justice. The story of the Selma March continues to resonate today. It reminds us that change doesn't come easily, but it does come when people stand together, when they refuse to give up, when they keep marching forward no matter what obstacles they face. It's a story of American courage, persistence, and the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things.